In this video, Dr. Jordan Peterson explains how rationality has a totalitarian element to it.
Then we switch to Scar. Now, Scar is Mufasa's brother, evil brother. The king always has an evil brother. And so does the hero. The hero always has an adversary. And the reason for that is the king always has an evil brother. And that means that the state always has a tyrannical element. And the tyrannical element exists for two reasons. One is the state deteriorates of its own accord. And that's an entropy observation. What that means is that the state is a construction of the past, right? But the present isn't the same as the past. And to the degree that the past is mismatched with the demands of the present, then it's tyrannical. It's malfunctioning. And so it's a continual problem with the state. It's always two steps behind the environment. And so then that means that the awareness of living people has to update the state. And so Mircea Eliade, who's a great historian of religions, looked at flood stories from all over the world, because there are flood stories from all over the world, partly because there are floods all over the world. But there's a psychological reason too. So you imagine that New Orleans was wiped out by a hurricane, right? A flood. And you say, well, that was an act of God. But then you think, wait a second. They knew those damn dikes weren't going to hold. They knew they weren't built strong enough. They took the money that was allocated to the dikes and spent it badly, and that was willful blindness. And so you could say that it was God who caused the flood, so to speak, metaphorically, but you could also say that it was the degeneration of the state and the willful blindness of the politicians that caused the flood. In Holland, they built the dikes to withstand the worst storm in 10,000 years. In the southern US, they built them to withstand the worst storm in 100 years. And they knew that that was insufficient. And so the flood, if there's a flood, well, you can say, well, that's an act of nature, but you can also say, just wait a sec. Maybe there was a flood because we looked the other way and because our systems were out of date. And that's why in flood stories, there's a continual theme, which is the people get wiped out by the flood because God judges them harshly for their senility and their willful blindness. And it's a story that's very much, you'll have a flood in your life. Right? It'll be a flood of chaos, and you'll find of one form or another, and you'll find when you investigate the causes of the flood that some of it will be, and sometimes this is the case, it's just random. You just got singled out, you got a terrible disease, and that's the end of you, or something like that. But there'll be other situations where the flood comes and you're surrounded by chaos, and you'll look into it and you'll think, I knew this was coming. I knew I wasn't paying attention. I knew I hadn't sorted things out. And the consequences of that will have cascaded and wiped you out. And then you're in real trouble, because not only did you get wiped out, but you also know it's your fault. And that is not a good thing. That makes you bitter and resentful and murderous when that happens. So anyway, Scar is scarred, right? So what that implies is he's had a pretty rough life, and he's kind of skinny, and he said he was born in the low end of the gene pool, and so he has reasons to be resentful. He's also hyper intelligent and rational, and it's one of the things you see very commonly about the evil adversary of the state or of the individuals, often intelligent and hyper rational. And the best commentator on that was probably John Milton in Paradise Lost, because that's how he represents Lucifer, or Satan, who's the spirit of rationality and enlightenment, strangely enough, hence Lucifer, the bringer of light. And the reason for that, as far as I can tell, and this is something that Milton figured out when he compiled all these ancient stories about evil and tried to make them coherent, was that the problem with rationality is that it tends to fall in love with its own productions. Right? And so then it comes up with a theory, and it makes that a totality, and then it won't let go. So the rational mind has a totalitarian element. And we know that to some degree because that kind of rationality seems more left hemisphere focused, and the left hemisphere tends to impose structured order on the world and be updated by the right hemisphere. And the right hemisphere generally updates it with negative information and with fantasy. And so the left hemisphere will impose a coherent structure on the world, which is really necessary for you to live in it. But the problem is there's a tension between coherence and completeness. And that's partly why you need two hemispheres. You need one to represent the world, and you need one to keep track of the exceptions and to feed those slowly into the representational system so that it can stay updated without collapsing into complete chaos.